Let's introduce our guests for today's debate. Supporting the yes side on question 2 is the president of American Promise and former Massachusetts Assistant Attorney General, Jeff Clements. Welcome, Jeff. Good to have you.
Good to be here, Anthony. Thanks.
And supporting the no side on question 2 is Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance spokesperson Paul Craney. Paul, welcome to Radio Boston. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's begin. We did a coin toss before the start of the debate to figure out who will go first. And so we're going to hear first from Jeff Clements, representing yes on number 2. Your 1-minute opening statement, Jeff Clements.
Vote yes on question 2 to put citizens, we the people, in control of our government. Our politicians spend way too much time raising money from corporations, unions, and wealthy interests rather than representing us. Money in politics is not free speech. It's power. And it's out of control. Yes on 2 creates a nonpartisan, volunteer citizen commission at zero cost to the taxpayer to advance an amendment to the U.S. Constitution so we can limit the corrupting influence of billions of dollars of special interest money in our elections. This will give all Americans free speech and a voice in our self-government. We face daunting challenges in this country. $21 trillion in national debt, a climate catastrophe, an opioid crisis, skyrocketing pharmaceutical prices. Big interests that profit from the status quo are buying our political system, so we can't solve these challenges. We need a constitutional amendment to give all citizens a voice so we can work together to solve these problems. Question 2 is a big step forward to that amendment. Please vote yes on 2.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Paul Craney, representing no on 2. Go ahead, Paul.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. This is a very important issue. I'm glad to be here and spend a half an hour talking about freedom of speech and association. I ask the listeners to please consider voting no on 2 for the very purposes of that. We are trying to preserve the right of freedom of speech, preserve the right of expression, keep the voice of the people with the people instead of having government regulate and contradict and restrict our speech.
Okay, so we're going to go to questions now. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you since you're in favor of a yes on 2. So let me start with just a really basic question. I mean, if a candidate has an appealing message or a platform, if they want to make a film, a movie, whatever it is, why shouldn't they be allowed to raise and spend as much money as they want to put that message out there?
Well, you know, campaigns and elections aren't like going to a marketplace and buying a car or anything else. It's a special place where all citizens are equal. We want in this country economic vitality. Not everybody has the same wealth and the same means, but we also have a principle since the American Revolution of equal citizenship. And that means in the political sphere, we got to be careful to not let unlimited money take over the politics so that all Americans can participate. So there'll be plenty of money in elections after the amendment, but it will come from lots of sources in smaller amounts. And candidates and campaigns will have lots of ways to get out their message. But it'll involve all Americans in participating. You know, in 2016, 3 billionaires alone put in $200 million, just 3 people. That's not democracy, it's aristocracy.
Well, let me just follow up and just push back on one point. What about the Bernie Sanders model? Because he managed to raise a huge amount of money from lots of small donations. He didn't seem to be at a competitive disadvantage.
Well, you know, it's not about individual candidates. We have a systemic problem. And I think what Bernie Sanders showed, and what as Ken said at the outset, what Donald Trump in some ways showed at the beginning of his campaign is the hunger in America for a different kind of model. And campaigns that can inspire the small donors, that's actually a sign of the future. The problem is, you know, Bernie Sanders lost, and this isn't about whether you win or lose with more money. The problem is when you have systemic, powerful interests that are able to put billions in, it overwhelms those small dollar systems. I think we'll see plenty more small dollar candidates after this amendment. That will be the model that we'll see from everybody, and whether it's conservative or progressive.
Paul Craney, your response.
I'm glad we're talking about this amendment because it's so important in campaign finance law to always look at everything the prism. Is it fair and clear? Campaign finance law always has to be those two things. If it's not, you should definitely run and do everything to defeat it. We see time after time elected officials in Massachusetts and Boston and Washington, D.C. who use campaign finance system as a weapon to silence speech, opposing views, and their opposition. If history repeats itself, I don't have to go that far back to bring up example after example. Just in Massachusetts, just this year, we had a state rep, so a state lawmaker in Massachusetts, who proposed a piece of legislation. Their proposal would make it illegal with criminal offenses for anyone to speak out against their voting record, their positions and background. So let that just settle in there. Elected official in Massachusetts, not joking around behind closed doors saying, wouldn't it be great to get those guys and gals who oppose us, but actually proposing legislation for criminal penalties so if anyone speaks out against them, they would have to go to jail based on their positions, which can change hourly, and my position at breakfast could change by dinner time. So why I'm talking about this issue is because the ballot question, number 2, would empower state lawmakers and a bunch of politicians in Boston to come up with ways to restrict your freedom of speech. And that should be really troublesome. The great thing about the First Amendment, it empowers individuals. Citizens United, there's a lot of talk about it, but one thing it did really well is that it was clear and fair for everyone, individuals, employers, and labor unions, so that they can all have a fair and clear shot for their freedom of speech. What this amendment would do, again, the devil's in the details of campaign finance law, is go and ask state lawmakers and a bunch of other politicians who have a vested interest, mind you, to keep their jobs, and who are for the most part in Massachusetts Democratic, to regulate individual speech.
Paul, can we, this is James Pindell from the Globe, can we just step back for a second? Because we have been in a very partisan time where no one can agree on the time of day. But the one thing that Americans have agreed on, at least according to one Pew Research poll from this May, found that 72% of Americans feel that big money political donors have more influence than the average Joe. Do you agree in general that big money donors have more influence? And if so, isn't that a problem for democracy?
James, if you're wrong, it's probably 80% would agree to your poll. Your concern is valid. A lot of people think about this. Typically, who likes to say, I support big money in elections and politics, right? I mean, that's a weird thing to say. That's a good thing. But I would actually argue what Citizens United did was give everyone a clear path for how they can express their speech. It allowed labor unions, employers who oftentimes sit at the opposite end of the bargain table, to have their independent voice in elections and public policy. Allowed individuals. Now, look, if I tomorrow won the lottery, and I'm sure my friends and family would say, please don't do this, but if I wanted to take that lottery winning and go spend it as an independent expenditure or a super PAC, I could. That's the great thing about America, is that it doesn't pick winners and losers. And unfortunately, restricting speech in campaign finance law does exactly that. It says you can win and you can lose, and let's put discrimination into the U.S. Constitution.
That's time. Go ahead, Jeff. What's your response?
Well, this is about free speech. The First Amendment protects the freedom of speech of all Americans. It's not just about free speech for those who win the lottery. And if we've come to a place in this country where you need to win a lottery to have free speech, and everyone else is just silenced because they don't have the money to play in that game, again, that is not a republic of equal citizens. And after the Watergate scandal, something like 24 corporations actually pled guilty to crimes for running money into the political system. Not one of them claimed they had a First Amendment right to do that. This is a new, reckless experiment in pretending that spending money is freedom of speech. It is not. And if we allow it to be that way, most Americans will not have freedom of speech. So what this commission does is actually create the place to get the amendment language right. So unions, corporations, and people will have very clear rules. Everybody will have a chance to participate who's a human being and a citizen. And economic entities like corporations and unions can focus on business and the economy.
Well, Jeff, let me come back to you. This question's for you as the proponent of question 2. So political donations, you mentioned that this is sort of a new phenomenon, but political donations have been classified by the courts as a form of speech with more than 40 years of legal precedent, dating all the way back, as we heard from Kenneth at the top of the hour, to this 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision. So there's a lot of sort of legal foundation, I guess, in this idea that money is classified, that political donations are classified by the courts as a form of speech. Doesn't that mean that limiting spending or restricting these kinds of contributions is going to be a hard pull in the courts, and that you are the argument is that you're blocking or censoring speech?
Well, no, that's actually why we're using a constitutional amendment. The court has gotten it wrong for 40 years. They have gone all over the place, a series of 5-4 decisions. You're right, going back to Buckley. But remember, Buckley came after 200 years of American history. Massachusetts first limited campaign contributions in 1907. The Tillman Act prohibited corporations from spending money in federal elections in 1907. Unions were not allowed to spend money in elections in 1948. Only in 1976 did the idea that money is the same as free speech get created. And we've had an activist court fabricate rights for corporations and money at the expense of the people and our democracy. So this amendment actually does the court a favor. They've gone back and forth in these 5-4 decisions, first saying one thing, then saying another, and then Citizens United just bulldozing the walls that protected our democracy down. So the amendment will actually clear up things.
Paul Craney, your response.
I appreciate that Jeff can recognize that he thinks certain people in power at the Supreme Court may have gotten some decisions wrong. But if you were to sit here and actually think empowering a bunch of state lawmakers who have a history of restricting speech for opposing views in opposition will not be much worse than I have something to share with you. That's not the way campaign finance law runs in the state. Very often there's a lot of people that have good intentions, but they use it as a weapon to silence speech. And unfortunately, what we're trying to do is if you vote yes on question 2, you are empowering people whose only job is self-preservation, and no offense to them, but their only job is to win re-elections, to craft your speech as the public and to restrict it. And time after time, they have actually failed at that pretty badly.
Paul, I want to follow up quickly, and we're running a little out of time on this particular segment, but I want to get your follow-up question on what you mentioned about winning the lottery and then spending that money however you want to spend it on a political cause. Isn't there something different? And I think that's what a lot of people are saying right now. Isn't there something different between you as an individual spending that money and then a made-up corporation for the purposes of an election spending that money with donors we just don't even know who's involved there? Isn't there a difference there? Like your name, you won the lottery, you're going to put your pet issue up there versus a nameless corporation with nameless donors?
Well, that was kind of a joke. That was, obviously I don't.
But it's a very important distinction. I
know. But James, okay, so you're trying to make this distinction of big corporations who are not individuals,
or an invented one for the purpose of an election.
Okay, well, that's very few and far between. I think that's kind of highly regulated at this point. But for the most part, let's just use the example of a corporation, WBUR, or any other corporation, American Promise, the group that Jeff works for, which is a nonprofit corporation. It's made up of individuals like WBUR who give to WBUR. There's other for-profit corporations, but corporations is a pretty broad term. So it's very important to know the difference. In Jeff's case, his corporation is a nonprofit made up of individuals and corporations who donate to his group. And in this case, he's used his nonprofit to fund his ballot question. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's his freedom to use his nonprofit corporation to fund a ballot question. And that's one of the beauties of Citizens United is that they're able to give more freedom to entities like that. But to your point of other corporations like Exxon or whatever you want to name, they actually do have some rights. I can't, as an individual, go up to Exxon or any big corporation and say, hey, you know what? I want a list of all your customers. I want your financials. They have rights. Just like the government can't go.
We have time. Sorry, we have less than a minute left. Do you want to?
I'd like to respond to that. Yeah. Now, first of all, on American Promise, we have thousands of donors. Average donation about $36. Those are people. You can go to the website, look up how is American Promise funded, see who those donors are. We believe in disclosure. People govern, not money. The ballot committee, all the contributions are disclosed. Now, let's talk about politicians. If you want to empower people, not politicians, vote yes on 2. The incumbency power to raise money since Citizens United is so high. 40% of state legislative districts in this country are uncontested now since 2010 in Citizens United. Politicians who are elected have massive advantage to raise money from big interests who then they will regulate. They get it from unions, they get it from big corporations, and they get it by the boatload. And so we've got competitive districts no longer competitive. We've got incumbents who can't be challenged because it takes too much money and you don't have the power to leverage your lawmaking to get big contributions. So you want to have more competitive elections, challenge incumbents, empower the people, vote yes.
Let's go to a caller right now to start off this section. Ellen is calling from Clinton, Ohio. Ellen, you're on the air. Go ahead. Thanks for the call.
Okay. Hi, Jeff. I'm from Port Clinton, Ohio.
Yeah, you got a question? Go ahead.
I do. I'm entirely in support of the issue in Massachusetts. And I think that I would like to see something happen all over the country in terms of this effort. And what suggestions would Jeff have for us to start this in our own states? I'm from Ohio.
So, Jeff, let's turn that into a question that both you and Paul can sort of debate. How widespread is the energy for this, do you think, across the country?
Well, the energy's very well spread because Americans know we have to do this or lose our democracy. I think people are feeling shut out of the political system. They're either turning away or they're turning into anger. And I think what we can do with this amendment is bring Americans together because 80% support it. We've seen 19 states now have passed initiatives and resolutions supporting this amendment. As James mentioned, 4 of those states were by ballot initiative. 800 cities and towns around the country are doing this. And, Brad Smith said on your show the other day that there's, from his perspective, a concern that this will have a ripple effect if we vote yes on 2 and have the Citizen Commission. We need that ripple effect. That's exactly the intent. So we hope this ripple effect will get people moving in other states to do a similar Citizen Commission and get together as citizens to make sure we can have a political system that works for everybody.
So, Paul Craney, your response to that, 19 states, 800 cities and towns, does that suggest to you that there's a sort of critical mass of concern across this country about this issue?
I would actually argue the opposite. After Citizens United, actually what happened was Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Conservatives, Liberals, and everything in between have been exercising their free speech because of Citizens United. It's funny, you have me here. Of course, I work with Mass Fiscal. It's a conservative organization based in Boston, and I'm defending Citizens United. And in Massachusetts, the biggest benefactor of Citizens United are the unions. 9 out of 10 super PACs in Massachusetts are union super PACs. And that's the case across the country, is that this issue has empowered more people with speech. And as a result, both political parties benefit, and every part of the spectrum, liberals and conservatives, they also benefit. So as much as there might be some ballot efforts here and there, that is skewed compared to the amount of people, employers and unions who are exercising their freedom of speech because of Citizens United.
Paul, I want to step back for a second here. We've been talking in theory. Our questions have been about big money or money in politics. But if you actually want to talk about the process of what's on the ballot.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
All it's doing is creating a volunteer commission of 15 people to research the issue and come up with some proposed language. We're certainly not overturning a U.S. Supreme Court decision. If all we're doing is creating a small commission to research something, what's the big deal? Why vote no?
So, James, it's so important, as I said, with campaign finance law to look at the details with every piece of campaign finance law. So this ballot question before us, like I mentioned earlier, empowers a bunch of elected officials in Boston who are predominantly Democrat. And these elected officials can appoint commissioners or committee members, whatever you want to call it. And there's no guarantee that there'll be a wide variety of opinions there. I mean, they could put me on it, and I could still be overwhelmed with the opposing view. But you're empowering elected officials whose only job is for self-preservation, for them to be able to sound speech. And secondly, this ballot question does more than just put together ideas. What it does is it's recognizing individuals as the only ones in the Constitution who have rights, which means labor unions and employers are stripped of some of those rights. Now, I was trying to talk to you before about what that means, because you made the comparison if I win the lottery compared to like Exxon. So employers actually do have rights, and so do labor unions, right? The government can't just go to a company, can't go to WBUR and say, I want a copy of all your hiring records.
Paul Craney, we got to jump in because that red light is off. Jeff Clements, you get to respond.
Yeah, thank you. And the Citizen Commission is actually designed really well. If you vote yes on the Citizens Commission, if you vote yes on 2, you and any other Massachusetts citizen can apply to serve on it. It is intended to be inclusive. The elected officials who Paul refers to, who make the appointments, aren't allowed under the language of the petition and the language of yes on 2. They're not allowed to make appointments of anybody who hasn't publicly applied and identified where they're from, what their political affiliation is, because the petition encourages and really seeks a cross-partisan mix of people. Now, that's why we have support for yes on 2, not only from Elizabeth Warren and the Democrats, who Paul likes to refer to, but Charlie Baker, the governor, has endorsed this. Lieutenant Governor Polito has endorsed this. And yes, it will apply to unions. It'll apply to corporations. It'll apply to people. And this commission helps us get it right so that we all have free speech and everybody can participate.
But doesn't Paul have a point when he talks about how it's the very politicians we are discussing of regulating how they get their money and their power, who are going to end up appointing people on a commission that's going to directly impact how they get reelected. Isn't that sort of a really incestuous?
Yes.
I know we're in the weeds here, but I mean, doesn't he have a very good point here?
No, actually it doesn't, because I think people this campaign is 1,000 volunteers plus 130,000 to 200,000 conversations in the Commonwealth to put this on the ballot.
But 15 people on this commission.
Well, I'm going to answer that, and I'd like to use my time to answer it, if you don't mind, James. We have thousands of volunteers, thousands of signatures, and the reason they support this is because that problem was anticipated, and we, the people, will be the Citizen Commission. The appointment actually can't happen to somebody. If they haven't applied for this commission, they will not get on it. We've put controls on the politicians, and it's cross-partisan. So, at some point, of course, the lawmakers will make law. We need to get this amendment through Congress. We will do that. This Citizen Commission serves the people of the Commonwealth, and it actually opens up the political process and will challenge incumbents. So this is not about the politicians. It's about whether we, the people, are going to step up and try to repair this democracy.
Paul Craney, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the great thing about Citizens United is that it's clear and fair for everyone, employers, unions, and individuals. It gives them all the opportunity to speak as loud as they want, for as long as they want, so long as they don't coordinate with campaigns and their candidates. What we're debating right now is the details of question 2, which is empowering elected officials who have the desire for self-preservation to regulate our freedom of speech. So let's just play hypothetical. Who here agrees that we should allow elected officials like Donald Trump and a Republican Congress with Paul Ryan to regulate our speech? Probably no one. How about Cory Booker in the White House and Nancy Pelosi regulating our speech? Maybe a few more. But my point is, those are realities. When you are asking elected officials to regulate speech in campaign finance law, there will be winners and losers. There will be discrimination in the Constitution if you ask elected officials to regulate your speech.
So, Paul Craney and Jeff Clements, our time is running down. We're going to have time just for one closing statement each from each one of you. And Jeff, since you went first in your opening statement, Paul Craney, you get to go first in the closing statement.
Please vote 2. If you vote 2, you're preserving the right of freedom of speech. If you vote yes on 2, you're asking a bunch of elected officials in Massachusetts to regulate your speech.
Okay, that was you did that briefly and to the point. Jeff Clements, you get a full minute if you want it. Go ahead.
So vote yes on 2 if you want to protect free speech. If you want to pretend that spending billions of dollars is actually free speech, sure, vote against it. But if you want free speech for everybody, and if you want some controls on the amounts of money flowing in from billionaires, outside sources, dark money, even now foreign sources, vote yes on 2. The American Revolution started here in Massachusetts. It replaced aristocracy with democracy based on principles of equal citizenship, a system where everyone can run for office, whether you're born in a log cabin or a mansion, and where every citizen, not just the wealthy, has a voice, has free speech. That revolution is at risk now if billionaires, corporations, unions, special interests can buy the laws and the elections. That's not democracy. So vote yes on 2 to renew our commitment to the American Revolution, to get involved in putting our people together to help solve some of the biggest problems we've seen in this country in our history.
All right. Well, that wraps up the debate for today. Stay with WBUR and the Boston Globe for complete coverage of the November midterm elections, including all the ballot questions. Big thanks to our guest today, Paul Craney, spokesperson for the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance, representing the no side of question 2. Paul Craney, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me on.
And Jeff Clements, president of American Promise, representing the yes side of question 2. Jeff Clements, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And a special thanks to our partners at the Boston Globe and to James Pindell, Boston Globe reporter, for co-hosting today. James, great having you in here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony. We also want to thank our other co-sponsor, the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And thanks to our audience on WBUR, New England Public Radio, and online.